Today I'm here to ask the question, can horror books be as scary as movies? I'm going to provide my opinion, but I want you all to chime in the comments as well. The short answer to this is maybe, but in my personal opinion, horror books have to try a lot harder than movies for various reasons that I'm about to get into. First, let's talk about the advantages that movies have. First one being the obvious one of visuals. So I understand that books can technically have illustrations, but you don't see that a lot in adult fiction. And even if they do exist, they are either drawn or however they are depicted, simply they are static as opposed to movies that have the opportunity to have moving visuals. So whether it be just the actors on the screen or special effects, there is more opportunity to create visual scares in a way that just is not as directly available in books. So I think that that's kind of an easy gimme right there. Then there's also the consideration about how we consume movies versus books. And the fact is, typically when we sit down to watch a movie, at least most people, we are watching the whole movie all in one go, allowing us to have the full complete experience. And unless we're stopping and pausing the movie to go to the bathroom, but especially if we see it in theaters, we really can't control the pace of the movie and we're very much stuck immersed in the experience. However, it's more rare, especially with a full-length novel, you're rarely going to sit down and read the whole thing in one go. Instead, you're going to stop and start. You'll put a bookmark in it and typically read it not just in multiple sittings, but multiple days, even weeks at times. And you just don't have that complete experience that you feel like you can't escape the story. You can just put it aside very easily in a way that's a little bit more difficult with movies. Along the same lines, we also tend to watch movies in scarier environments than we do reading. And I know for myself, I often will read books at my work, which means that it's under the fluorescent lights in the middle of the workday, as opposed to when I'm watching a movie. Typically, if I'm going to have that full proper experience with a good horror movie, I'm going to watch it in our dark basement at night and try to have the lights down low and really, again, have that full experience. And I don't necessarily do that when I'm reading books. And so again, I think that lends itself to the opportunity to get a little bit more scared and anxious as we watch. The final advantage that movies have is kind of an obvious one, but I'm going to point it out anyway, and that's the fact that movies have the opportunity to jump scare us. Movies, as I mentioned, with the fact that we consume them in one go, have a lot more control over the pacing of the story, and so you can have something that's slowly getting revealed, and then a character jumps out of the screen, and that does not necessarily work on the page. So definitely, in terms of jump scares, movies have the win there, but I know a lot of people say that jump scares, in their opinion, are often one of the weakest or considered to be one of the cheapest ways to elicit horror or scare on the screen. And a lot of people really praise movies that manage to be scary without using jump scares and do kind of different things to surprise and create unexpected results for the audience. However, to present the counter argument, I would say that there are two advantages that I identified for reading books, and they have potential to be scarier than movies in certain ways. The first one is that psychological aspect, which is something that's kind of hard to describe, but the idea that you are experiencing the whole book in your head. So the book and the story live entirely there. Now, you could argue again, the counter argument to that is the fact that you have the visual aspect to the movies, but there is something about a story that you can't really get out of your head because there is nowhere else to put it. I do find sometimes with books that they just linger in my brain because, again, the entire processing of the story happens there, and you don't necessarily have that outward way to express your relationship or your interaction with the book otherwise. And so I definitely had it where books just kind of niggle in my ear the same way that you can have a song that just stays in your ear as like an earworm. I have that same experience sometimes with books, and it really can start to mess with me when perhaps certain aspects of the book start to parallel things in my personal life. The other advantage that books have over movies is the fact that we tend to experience them solo rather than consuming them with a group of other people. So I realize you can absolutely watch a movie by yourself. Some people prefer that. Some people do that just because that is the easiest way to watch movies when you don't necessarily have friends with the same taste. But for a lot of people, I think they would agree that typically it's great if you can have that experience of sharing a movie with other people as opposed to books. Obviously there's exceptions, there's read-alouds, etc. But for the most part, most adult readers are consuming their books by themselves as a solo experience and activity. And so because of that, I think reading a book, you have that isolation that can lead to a more scary experience as opposed to a movie, which I don't know about you, but even if I'm watching a horror movie with friends, even if it's the first time we've seen it, my friends and I like to crack a lot of jokes and it always cuts the tension. So even if we're watching a movie in the middle of the night, when it's dark, and all the other elements are there to make it a scary experience, we keep commenting and joking around, and it just makes the movie less scary, more of a safe experience, which maybe is why I like watching movies or horror movies with other people, but it definitely makes it less scary than if I were to watch them alone, which I just don't do very often when it comes to horror. So I'm gonna try to end this video with some useful or constructive ideas about how you can enhance the scariness factor with your books. I think a lot of people want to be scared by their books. I hear people say that they pick up a horror book, especially in spooky season, and think, I want to be scared, I want that experience, and they're left very disappointed. And you often see that in reviews of books, especially again in horror, where you see people say, I didn't like this book because it didn't scare me, 1 star. And while I make the argument that a horror book does not need to be truly scary in order to be a good book, I understand that people want that experience, and I enjoy it too when it comes up, when I have that moment of being scared by a book. It doesn't happen often, but it's so special and so fun when it does. And so I want to give you all some recommendations based off what I'm talking about to try to get more of the movie experience in your book reading to hopefully up the scare factor. The first one is to read in the dark if possible, or at least in low light. I realize that if you're reading a physical book, you can't read in complete darkness, but you can have just a lamp on. You can go back to your days maybe at summer camp and get a flashlight. I've done that and it's very fun. And again, if you're doing an e-reader, you have a lot of control over the backlight, things like that, that can really control how much light is there. The other thing you can consider to do is to read at night if possible. Again, I fully admit that if I'm trying to have that scary experience with a book, if I read it during my lunch break at work with the fluorescent lights shining down on me, I know I'm not going to be scared the same way. So sometimes I will purposely save horror books to read at night, and then I will instead read some of my other genres like fantasy or science fiction during the day. So if I think a book has scare potential, I will set up my environment accordingly. My next recommendation won't apply to everyone, but if you're someone who lives with other people, whether it be family members, a spouse, etc., I encourage you to read your scary books when you are home alone. Now I recognize that some people just live alone, and so that is their natural environment, and I respect that. But for those of you that have the opportunity to read alone when you're not used to the experience of being always by yourself in the house, that is a great experience there. I talked about in previous videos reading, for instance, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, that true crime book that talks about home invasions. And I read this one section of it while my husband wasn't home. And it just really terrified me because it was all about this woman's house getting broken into. And I thought, oh my gosh, that could be me. And it made the book so much scarier because my husband wasn't nearby. Of course, then later in the book, you find out that the invasions were still happening when the husband was home, which kind of defeated the purpose of my husband being home. Anywho, but that's a case where not having my husband nearby when I was reading that book definitely made me feel more anxious and scared, if that's a good thing. The next one is something I think I've touched on my channel before, but it's worth saying again. It's worth saying again and again until people actually start to change their habits. And that's the fact that in order to have a scary experience with a book, you need to put away other distractions, specifically your phone. And so unless you're reading on your phone itself, I encourage you to turn your phone off, put it on silent, or just allow it only to ring in emergencies. Put it away from you, put it on a charger, and do not let yourself look at the TV or have your phone or other distractions that are going to keep you from being fully immersed in the book. I know for myself, sometimes I'm reading a really scary scene in a book, and then suddenly my phone dings and I'm scrolling Instagram or looking at an email from a publisher or something that just is not necessary in that moment. We are so unfortunately trained in this age of technology and social media that we always want to have our phones nearby, and we're just always looking for different distractions. We want to multitask by having, again, the TV on in the background. But again, if you actually want to have a scary experience, you need to take all of that away and just experience the story in and of itself. An extra tip that will work for some people if you're open to doing audiobooks, which I know not all my readers are that are watching this, but if you do audiobooks anyway, tying into an earlier point, I talked about reading in the dark, but specifically read in the dark with an audiobook. So have the experience where you're lying in bed, perhaps trying to fall asleep, and put on that audiobook and close your eyes. So again, if you're doing an audiobook of a horror book and you're doing the laundry, you're doing the dishes, you're making supper, you're probably not going to be very scared by that book because you don't have its full attention and you have other things around you that are going to kind of remind you that you're safe and keep you from getting fully immersed in the story. My best, scariest experiences with books honestly tend to be audiobooks in the middle of the night, especially when my son was younger. I was waking up in the middle of the night and then had to fall back asleep. So I would set a 15-minute timer on my phone and listen to a little bit of an audiobook. Those moments tend to be some of the scariest things I've ever experienced because again, I have zero distractions. It's completely pitch black because I don't need any light to listen to an audiobook. And you have someone talking quietly in your ear about some terrifying event and you can see the description or see what is happening in your mind so well that you can't help but visualize it. Even if you're like me and don't always visualize things well, those are some incredible experiences. Again, I know not everyone does audiobooks, so if it's not your thing, skip over this recommendation. Hopefully something else will work for you. So for myself, there are certain triggers, which I've talked about in other videos, that definitely scare me a lot more. And so it's just a matter of finding out what scares you. So for instance, I have friends that believe in ghosts. And so I know that haunting stories are a lot more effective for them because of that. Or there can be stories that lean into different survival horror. Maybe you had a scare about being out in the cold ones or different kinds of deprivation, and you kind of lean into the things that terrify you. Obviously, I don't want anyone to step into things that are true triggers for them in terms of like sexual abuse, things like that. But if you can dabble into something that really scares you, that is a good way to go. For instance, my husband, terrified of bees. I would love to have him read a horror story about bees because it would be nightmare fuel for him in a way that if I picked up a horror story about bees, I'd probably find it kind of silly and campy just because bees don't really scare me that much. I don't want to be stung by a bee, but it doesn't really bother me to have bees around the same way that he will run across the room. And so just identifying what scares you and then finding the books to match. The great thing with the horror genre is it's growing, especially with indie fiction. So honestly, if you just look up online, fear of drowning, fear of heights, fear of rabid dogs, I'm sure there is the right book out there for you. It's just a matter of finding it based off your personal taste. And that is the piece that is hard for me as a reviewer to recommend you the scariest books. I've done videos on it and I always try to make sure that you understand why it was scary for me, because I know I've had people read those books and say, oh, they're not scary. What are you talking about? And it all comes down to that very personal experience. The same way that romance is very personal to the individual, what attracts them to another person. The same thing with horror. Everyone has different fears, different triggers, and it's all about kind of dancing on the edge of the things that we can't handle and just exploring that fiction in an otherwise safe space. So that's it for this video here, but I'd love to continue the conversation down below in the comments of the suggestions I made. Are there any that you're going to try out for yourself? And let me know, do you believe that horror books can be scary? Have you been scared by a horror book? Can they possibly be scarier than a movie? And if you have any other suggestions, ideas, or comments on how to improve or enhance the scariness factor in a book, love to hear it. Let's discuss. Let's keep this conversation going. If you're new to my channel and want to stick around, subscribe. I do review and talk about horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, and other dark things. If you want to hit that little notification bell, if you want to hit that thumbs up, and if you just want to hit a little emoji like a ghost, I appreciate it. Lets me know you're here. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.